So hopefully everybody's ready to take this to the last step. Now, throughout the whole process of making beer, we need to have been clean, sanitary. We don't want any stuff in there that we don't need. Monitoring your temperature, your pH, all of those things are critical. That's why there's so much science and biology behind making beer. If it gets dirty and you get bacteria in it, can screw everything up. If your temperature's not right, screws everything up. There's just so many little variables here. It's not a just simple everybody can do it process. It takes knowledge and experience to do this and do it well. But it is not, as I said, overly complex where with experience, with patience, anybody can learn how to do this and do it well if you approach it from a scientific method perspective. So remember that concept. If at the end what you've produced is terrible, go back through your steps. What did you do that maybe made it taste bad or that messed something up? Was it too hot, too cold, didn't cook long enough? That's a scientific method process of science we've talked about before with previous lectures. So brewers are constantly using the scientific method to ensure their product is good. So let's take the wort, that big barley soup, and let's ferment it. So our third stage is fermentation. Now, what we want to do is get the wort cooled down and moved over into a fermentation vat. So temperature, again, plays a role here. These are high-tech, fancy, incredibly expensive fermentation vats, the industrial scale. Most home brewers, 5-gallon bucket can work. So you don't need this kind of equipment if you're trying to do this small scale. But with fermentation, the key is, let me move over here. The key is taking your wort, okay, so you take your wort, cool it down, get it to a fermentation vat. So now the big thing that we want to pay attention to is we need that maltose or that sugar. That's the key ingredients. And that is going to be fed to the yeast. So we're handing it off or we're adding yeast to it to then begin fermentation. The yeast cells will run fermentation if there is no oxygen. That's the key, no oxygen. So these fermentation vats are sealed to prevent oxygen from getting in. If you're doing this at home, you better seal that jug, that bucket, whatever you're using, seal it to prevent oxygen. If oxygen gets in there, the yeast, forget fermentation, we're going to run aerobic respiration, and it's not going to produce your alcohol as your end product. So remember where the sugar came from, though. Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis enabled the plant to produce the sugar in the form of starch. We broke the sugar down, we broke the starch down to maltose by the use of enzymes, and then the yeast is going to take over and run the fermentation step. So these pathways are connected. Without good photosynthesis, we can't do fermentation. But the idea is all of these steps work in order to get to the end product, and that is the beer we're trying to make. So we've seen these guys before, but they're back. The brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, those are the guys, those are the organisms we want to use for fermentation. Everybody can tweak it, a little bit different one, different yeast, different variety, based on the end product you're trying to make. but the goal here is the yeast convert the sugar into alcohol because they're forced into fermentation. All right, so here's the overview of fermentation. And I'm going to put this in here really big to make sure you guys remember it. It's one of the critical things. Fermentation is also known as anaerobic respiration. No oxygen. So if you have oxygen, you shift to aerobic. That's not good if you're trying to make beer. In the human body, we want aerobic. If we shift to anaerobic, that's bad for us. That's what causes muscle cramping, fatigue. That's that lactic acid buildup. Anybody who's an athlete has experienced. That's anaerobic in the human body. Not a good thing. 2 to 3 minutes and we die if we're anaerobic. So we want aerobic, but for beer making, we want anaerobic. We want fermentation. So the yeast is trying to take the sugar, break it down, convert it into ATP, and what we'll see happen here is the yeast will use the ATP for growth, for energy, etc. It's a living organism. It uses that for its daily life, and it only gets maybe 2 to 4 ATP for this, but that's okay because it's a single yeast cell. Aerobic respiration generates anywhere from 34 to 36 ATP. And one may think, well, why don't we use aerobic for the process? Because the end product of aerobic respiration is not alcohol. That's why we can't have aerobic during beer making. Anaerobic, a small amount of ATP, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. So this is your beer, or wine, or whatever fermented drink you're making. If you take honey and ferment it, you get stuff called mead. Same process, same concept. Okay, so we now have our beer. We bottle it, we retain the carbon dioxide, and we're good to go. But remember, the vessel has to be sealed when you're running fermentation to prevent oxygen from getting in there. So we have a can, a bottle, a keg, whatever of beer, and then we drink it. Now what we'll see with beer, alcohol gives us roughly 7 calories per gram of alcohol. If we were eating sugar, sugar gives us roughly 4 calories. So the same volume, the same mass of consumption, if we're consuming, just making it easy, 100 grams of alcohol, will equal roughly 700 calories. If you consumed the same 100 grams of sugar, you're looking at about 400 calories. So think about the difference between a bottle of Pepsi versus a bottle of beer. A lot more calories in alcohol. Now, beer makers have figured out ways to reduce the calories because people, oh, I'd like to drink a beer, but if I'm trying to watch my weight, I need to pay attention to the calories. So that's where you get all sorts of different beer that have reduced calories in them. But just general, a one-to-one comparison, a lot of calories are retained in that alcohol compared to sugar. And this is why overconsumption can lead to weight gain, the beer belly. All right, can happen to anybody. So the idea is moderation. So the last big thing to leave with here is I want you guys to look at how these two pathways are connected. How fermentation and respiration are similar, and then connect it back to photosynthesis. So with fermentation, we start with glucose. We don't have any oxygen, anything like that. And it makes ATP. Let me get back to the drawing. As I said before, you're going to get about 2 to 4 ATP. You're going to produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. No O2. Cellular respiration, you start with glucose, but we have the oxygen. ATP production, 34 to 36. Ooh, that's supposed to be, sorry. 36. A lot of ATP, still producing CO2, and then you give a byproduct of water, no alcohol. So when we're comparing and looking at it, good for humans, this one is bad for humans. In the beer industry, good for yeast, making beer, bad for yeast, making beer. So we have to control the environment to ensure if we're making beer, we keep it in a fermenting environment with no oxygen. Cellular respiration, we want, if we're humans, we want to keep it in cellular respiration and provide oxygen and avoid the fermentation in us because it's a bad thing. So different organisms use the systems or the pathways differently. Just depends upon what the end goal is. But we now have better knowledge about how to manipulate the environment to intentionally ferment sugars to get us in products. Wine was discovered accidentally when grapes would mold. Mold is a fungus. Yeast is a fungus. It would mold and they would eat them moldy. Sometimes they didn't have a choice because of limited food. I mean, this is going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to origin of winemaking. And they discovered, wow, these grapes are a little bit different. Edible, taste different, like the taste. And that's how winemaking began, was just accidental consumption of moldy grapes that were actually fermenting. So, stupid trivia for you guys, but same concept applies to the beer making. How did we figure this out? And we have continued to try to enhance the science behind it to give us better products. So big picture, biology of beer, we take a look at all the different aspects involved in it, the barley, the germination, the fermentation, the pathways, the enzymes. Those are all part of how beer making works. And then consumption. We could look at how does it work in our body when we're bringing in those calories and things like that. So I want you guys, again, I'm not, by no means am I advocating for drinking, but I want you guys to just look at the science and the biology behind a lot of the things in our daily lives and go, okay, there is biology all around us. Everything we do has a connection to biology, has a connection to science. And having a better understanding of that can make us appreciate these things better and maybe help us make better products. If we're making our own beer or cooking for ourselves, use some science to do it. and it'll come out maybe a little bit better.